Thank you to Professor Barker, and thank you to the University of Oklahoma. I'm having a terrific visit here for 3 days, and I hope you all will come to see me in University of Virginia. Make your way to Charlottesville sometime. I prepared a talk that has a mix of a little bit of motivation, a little bit of example in an extended form, and then a sample of other projects where it's been applied, and it culminates with what are the principles that hold it all together. So if you can hang on to the end, it'll be a nice take-home, something for you to remember into your careers, into your studies here in University of Oklahoma. So here I gave a similar talk at a meeting in China in July 2017, maybe 7 months ago. And what we decided there was that anyone who could say they did risk analysis, decision science, they would be booted out of Amazon or whatever corporate suite was making actual decisions. That we found as professors, we were arriving to situations where decisions had already been made, and we were there to allocate resources, do something other than decision making. And the example here, we said, well, what can we do if we can't make decisions? We might be able to approach an enterprise such as Amazon, one of the largest on the earth, and tell them their customers on Tuesday are not going to be the same as the customers on Wednesday and the following Tuesday, the next month, and the next year. Similarly, their top suppliers are going to change from one day to day and epoch to epoch. And the top reviewers, the top supply routes, or the top supply partners, those are going to be different from one to another. And if we could explain to them why and how the changes took place and how these priorities shifted from time to time, that's where we could add the most value. Not so much in decision making, but in explaining the disruption of priorities. That's going to be the theme of all my talk, and I'm going to talk about priorities that are in energy systems, in water systems, in other variety of infrastructure systems primarily, but I'm sure some of you all are Amazon customers, and maybe you're relating to that example. Because industrial engineering can be about anything. There's nothing stopping you from doing anything in your careers. The work that I do, it came from others in the nuclear engineering field in the 1970s. They had decided that environmental damages and damages to human society that could result from nuclear accidents, release of radiation into the environment, that warranted a systematic framework of asking which pipes are most prone to failure, which pumps, which valves, which computers, and on and on. It was the field of probabilistic risk assessment. It involved some topics you probably meet in your courses in fault trees and event trees, other kinds of probabilistic analysis, importance measures in fault trees. That was really one of the beginnings or leveling and agreement in the field of risk science, risk analysis, what it was all about. From nuclear, it became a topic for environmental sciences and even for healthcare, human health and safety in a variety of industries. And then Professor Barker and myself, Professor James, decided we couldn't only diagnose risk, we had to say what could be done about it. So that was around the 1990s when I met this other professor. He was deciding that risk should be about trade-off analysis and balancing of costs and risks and benefits. It got even bigger. In the early 2000s, the international standards community decided some of this approach that had been coming up principally in technology fields, that it was applicable to business, it was applicable to business processes, information sciences, how corporations should have good governance and interact one with another. And so the ISO 31000 standard decided that risk could be interpreted as it shows next to the top line. The work that I'm going to share to you today, it's derived from the Amazon motivation, and it's saying that scenarios comprised of emergent and future conditions, they change what's in the top 10 or the bottom 10 or the top 1,000 or bottom 1,000 of an enterprise or infrastructure system. So it's this top definition that's going to show in all the examples coming up. I mentioned of emergent and future conditions. These are coming from technology innovations. They might come from regulations. They might come from human behaviors or behaviors in the workforce. And we deal with a few of these at a time to keep a focus on top executives in a corporation or top leaders. We ask, what are the combinations of conditions that are most disruptive and least disruptive? What are the conditions that most matter and least matter? All this is going to come in some of the examples coming up. So I was about 8 years old in the middle of the 1970s, and I still remember where this book was on the shelf in my elementary school library. Does anyone know it from, it's been a popular book for many decades now. Anyone know the stories that are told in Hiroshima? This is a book that first captured the human scale, and it was a brilliant storytelling, but it also had much of the quantification of lives lost and immediately in the nuclear blast and then in the aftermath from the radiation poisoning. It made a big influence to me. So I brought it here to motivate the example that I'm about to introduce. And then in addition, the Society for Risk Analysis that Professor Barker mentioned, our society elects every year to the pantheon of risk analysis some prominent individuals. They've contributed to risk science, risk analysis, and they've passed on some time before. The individual here, Dr. Franklin, she began as a materials scientist, emigrated from Germany, made her way to Canada, was a prominent professor in Toronto, but she was, at the beginning of the 1960s, quite effective collecting baby teeth from by mail, by foot, by mouth to mouth, all the ways that you can imagine this would happen before the internet, and found in the baby teeth levels of strontium-90 from above ground nuclear testing. It was quite singular in bringing about the end of nuclear, above ground nuclear testing worldwide. President Kennedy received it, leaders of Canada, leaders of other nations, and that's one thing we are grateful doesn't happen in the world today. So that was what brought her to the pantheon of risk analysis, but it's another story of radiation in the environment, and that's the example I'm about to share coming up. So roughly 7 years ago, the Department of Homeland Security in the US, they were funding the metropolitan areas of the United States on preparedness. What could be done to counter 15 major planning scenarios that were a threat to the nation's security. And we accidented into this project, and it was decided we would not be in the groove of engineering, but we would meet social scientists. So this is the story of that example, what we ended up doing with a prominent sociologist. We were engineers, some transportation professionals, and this is a little bit of the background of what we know today. We called it then radiological dirty bomb. It's now radiological dispersion device, one of the concerns for the nation. So this is some of that telling that even when radiation is not sufficient to hurt you, it can make you hurt yourself. This is a bit the story. It can result in hysteria and confusion, and walking wounded in the population. So in a course of meetings, maybe 6 months worth in defining the scope of this project, we found this to be our goal, and it's today the goal of the example I'm about to show you, is figure out the needs of agencies for sheltering of a big population after a dirty bomb attack. And our case study is the National Capital Region, and you'll see NCR, NCR this, and NCR that in some of the slides that follows. All that means it's Washington, D.C., and some of the surrounding counties, and even some of the surrounding states. All right, with that goal, we decided with the larger team, with the sociologists, and with our sponsors, that there ought to be some learning to take place, something that could make this not only a project, but lessons learned for cities around the country. And this is what settled to be our tactics. One, we were going to study evacuation on the surface modes of transportation, and these would be foremost population that were told to shelter and nevertheless got in their vehicles or started off walking. So the first part is, how is the road network affected by disobedience of a public order to stay at your home or work? Second is, we decided we could help with the prioritization or the disruption of priorities for stockpiling of medicines, fuels, foods, communications devices, and so on. So we called those the priorities for emergency response initiatives. We could, with the help of the sociologists, perform a cell phone survey to many thousands of people in the National Capital Region. I'm going to give you some details of that. And that was formed by focus groups, interviews, and some good science and survey research. And along the way, we met through our presentations and disseminating of this work. I'm going to share some of that additional interests and requirements for mass emergency response, evacuation planning, all the rest. So here's what took place and resulted from one of the early focus groups. Is we said we got to keep it real, but not so real that it's overly complex. We devised 3 scenarios that would affect the region: a dirty bomb in the west, a dirty bomb in the north, and multiple dirty bombs going all around with no clear way to run. And this is a little bit of a map of the capital region, and I'm going to share some more maps with results overlaid coming up pretty soon. But when you see scenario 1A, 1B, those are the single dirty bombs. Scenario 2 is the multiple dirty bombs. And that's what we would introduce in the phone interviews, and in the study results. They're all going to have this scenario flavor to them. I could have brought today a 600-page book which had all the survey results. The survey took any individual 27 minutes on average on the phone to complete. It was driven by computer. It could be delivered in several languages, and the questions branched. If you answered one way to an early question, you got different questions later on. So all this came from having a solid scientist in sociology to tell us how to run the survey. And there was a good amount of work I'm not going to share today where the agencies ask, what are the crosstabs? If you find an individual who understands well what is a dirty bomb, but they have elderly relatives and no pets, and they take this medication but not this other medication, what do we learn about this individual? So that's what's the interest of the agencies, is finding the intersections of all kinds of character types and seeing if the results confirm, support, or upset their intuition, what particular types of people will do in these situations. All right, this is a couple of quotations about the intrinsic merit of the survey answers, but we didn't want to stop there. As engineers, we were curious how the survey results would spill over, inform, or become inputs to engineering models and ripple onto the transportation system and thereby guide us as we were allocating those emergency equipments. All right. We had a bit of, as engineers, some literature. Many had studied behaviors in emergencies and in particular in radiological emergencies, but not on such a large scale as an entire city, much less the capital of the United States. So this was recognition that behaviors mattered a lot in the literature, and some of that you're going to see informed us as we went on. So I told you initial scoping led us to the radiological example. Further downscoping led us to a few scenarios, and we got even more focused with the survey results and some of the meetings that came about as we presented the survey. This is a diagram of all the types of agencies that we met, interested stakeholders, parties to an emergency response or evacuation. They included mass care, healthcare workers, public preparedness, those are the fire, emergency, resource management, modeling and simulation community, because it turned out there were folks with capabilities to study large emergencies other than ourselves, and they wanted to have work into the future. So there's a little bit of a science interest, and of course the transportation professionals. And these different agencies, they had different interests for human behaviors and population behaviors. Some of that's showing here. Anytime you see a white circle, then the agency had a special interest for the services that are provided to the public, for the confidence that the public had in public utilities, and the presence or not of shelters, on and on. An interesting feature of this problem was who funded it and why. And the states outside of Washington, D.C., they fully believed they were going to have a lot of evacuees, and they would need to have shelters and decontamination facilities as far as Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Southern Virginia. They wanted to have a basis to justify those investments, or at least explore whether such basis existed. The red here indicates the down scoping I'm about to show. The transportation sector wanted to know where the shelters were going to be and what would be the breakdowns of the roadway in the evacuation. So much of what I'm about to show you is focused just on the small part of the chart. And this is a picture of a normal day in DC, and then you ask a resident of Washington, DC, what are you going to do if a dirty bomb explodes? Do you think your car will move? They describe, my car doesn't move on a normal day. Why are you asking the question? So we're about to see, did it matter? Is it worse than a 5 p.m. Friday rush hour, or better? What's all the consequence of it? So the pieces of our analysis have been commoditized. The assembly of it is relatively new. We took behavioral survey data. That's a usual to do. We took forecasts of traffic and knowledge of the travel network. We ran those, processed them through a travel demand model. This is a typical simulation optimization that's used for forecasting the need for new roads or expansions of existing roads. And we're going to ultimately find the critical locations on the road network, those that are most needful of attention in many thousands of miles of road. So more of what I told you already. We took the system apart into 600 parts, the 1,000 some miles, and the 3 scenarios, and the implications of putting this with this. That's what's coming on the next few slides. Washington, D.C. is in the middle of this map. This is Virginia. This is Maryland. West Virginia is over to the left. Pennsylvania up to the north. The 8 counties surrounding Washington, D.C., each of them have some number of people that are at work at 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. This is more detail of the scenario. And they're gonna do one of several things. They're going to do as they're told, stay in place, or they might move, and where are they going to move? So the phone survey found for members of this county called St. Mary's, are they going to have destinations elsewhere in the national capital region, and what particular destination would they have? And our survey scientist is able to correct for the number of responses relative to the actual populations at home and at work in these many jurisdictions. And then we use the travel demand model to show what are the implications for breakdowns and bottlenecks on the road network. More details of that coming now. Those jurisdictions or those counties that I showed you in the map, now those are the rows and columns of these 3 matrices. There's a matrix for each of the 3 scenarios. The bombing in the west, the bombing in the north, and the multiple bombings. The entries in the matrix are the number of people on the move, estimated from the survey of 2,700, 3,000 people who actually responded, ultimately completed the full 30-minute survey, and a bit of modeling projecting from sample data to the actual size of the region. And what it's telling us is that the scenarios of the single bomb, each of them put more people on the road than the scenario of the multi-bomb. So with multiple bombs, a little more than 700,000 people on the road. With the single bombs, it's on the order of 1 million people on the road in each of those. And that's explicable that if there's multiple bombs, someone doesn't necessarily know which way to run. They're going to be more confined in their thinking. We went, with the help of the transportation experts, from people moving to number of vehicles moving. So it's important in the survey, they were asked, are you going to move with your own vehicle, or are you going to go and ride with your neighbor? How many people are fitting into one vehicle? And this is a translation of people movements on the previous slide to vehicle movements on this slide. 800-some thousand, 500,000, and whatever that was in the scenario in the east. And knowing who's moving from where to where, those are how many vehicles are moving from what county to what other county, those are the entries in this table. This is only zooming in to one of the scenarios, vehicle movements across 19 origins and destinations. There's a little subtlety to this. These are inside national capital region origins and destinations, and we also studied the destinations outside the capital region. There's a bit more we needed to understand was who was at home and who was at work. This comes from the sample data, and that's different depending on which jurisdiction you start out, and you might have a bit different response or reaction if you're at home or you're at work to the sheltering order. I told you this was commoditized. It's one of the few equations in the presentation, but it's only to say about it, the sociologists were fascinated with what the transportation experts did, and the transportation experts were fascinated for the sociologists, but it wasn't much more than accounting. So mass balance or correction of sampling bias, they understood one another that way. This is the adding and correction for real population relative to the survey results. And here is some of what comes of it. I told you a bit about the evacuees in vehicles and passengers already, but these are some of the other results that came, is the number of people in the household, the vehicle occupancy rates, and anyone who might decide they're going to use public transit or the metro, if they're already on the metro, what happens. All right, so that's some of that. And the some of the findings, this is intermediate findings, I told you already. The multiple bombs, lowest movements, and the single bombs produced a bit of high movements. And then for those who were in the outer states, maybe 100 plus miles away from Washington, D.C., these are the numbers of people, evacuees, reminding these are the people who were told to shelter, the number of evacuees leaving the capital region, ending up in the far states, in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and so on, in the several scenarios. Despite there were fewer people on the road in scenario 2, there are more people leaving the national capital region in scenario 2. So this was a bit of increased understanding for those in building shelters in Pennsylvania and the far places. Here, the transportation science kicks in a bit higher gear. Is not only you know from those trips who's going where, but you can begin to predict the speeds on the sections of roads and the ratios of the actual traffic volume to the capacity of the roads and the volumes of passengers, of vehicles per hour and vehicles per day on those road sections. So we're going to, in the coming slides, be able to predict traffic volume, traffic speeds, and volume to capacity ratios, and find where the traffic is broken down. This is a picture of that. These red sections are areas where there's gridlock and stuck traffic, non-moving traffic. Those are places where there may be need for showers to get rid of the radiation contamination. There might be need for the fuel, for the vehicles running out of fuel. There might be need for medicines for people who need all kinds of medicines daily. So this is a bit of information. All this is the Washington, D.C. area here. It's a result of optimization, making an assumption those able to are choosing optimal routes to get from their origin to their destination. This is zooming in to say how agencies really love over this kind of information because they truly need to understand this is the lighter issue and this is the heavier issue. These are beltways around the capital region. Now, any individual thinking to leave, they are going to be informed, better capable of making a decision whether to evacuate or not if they understand how long it takes to move from place to place. So we here in these next couple of charts assumed a travel time from the center of Washington, D.C. as far as you could go in any direction. The contours here from the darkest pink colors to the lighter pink are distances that could be traveled in a fixed amount of time. This is a 2-hour contour, a 4-hour, an 8-hour, a 16-hour, 24, and all the way to the outer is a 48-hour contour, which is somewhat discouraging because this trip should only take a few hours, and the prediction is it would take 48 hours to go from Washington, D.C. to the shore of Delaware. From 2-hour trip to 48 hours. No one's vehicle is fueled for that kind of trip, so all of it is reinforcing that there's going to be some breakdowns. This was the bomb in the west. This was the bomb in the north. A little bit different result. Maybe someone cares one for the other. And this is the bomb in the north again. The multiple bombs, travel time contours, whether it made a difference. Remember, in the scenario 2, more vehicles leaving the national capital region for whatever reason. And this is the zoom out of the scenario 2. So all this is giving us the following results qualitatively. We found that there were failures distributed around the highway network, particular locations worthy of more resources, that for the various scenarios, despite being told to shelter in place, there were from several 100,000 to 1 million evacuees on the highway. We found the behaviors indeed were quite critical, and foremost among them being the disobedience to authority, maybe from a lack of trust, maybe from a lack of confidence in the source of information, sometimes from the way that information arrived to them, and including that people, the individuals in charge of the vehicles, they're making choices that are affected by all kinds of factors, whether they're pets at their homes, whether they need the medicines, elderly relatives, and so on and so on. So I'm going to share to you now how these findings, and in particular what we learned about human population behaviors, how those matter to priorities of the several agencies involved. In presenting all the work that I just showed to you, it came clear that agencies were concerned about these 5 major behaviors, and indeed these were real concerns. This is some way the survey reinforcing what were the agency's concerns. These 5 behaviors had to do with whether workers would stay in place if they were needed in the emergency. These are emergency private sector workers. Whether the population would shelter, we talked about that some already. Whether the population would trust in who's telling them what. Whether the population will rely on particular channels, whether it's TV or a neighbor, internet or other. And to what extent would people who are not contaminated necessarily, or they weren't anywhere near the blast, they might become psychologically disabled and not able to make clear choices or rational choices. They might be in a state of psychological shock and called walking wounded. So these 5 scenarios we're going to ask, are they disruptive to the priorities of the agency, similar to what I told you was motivating us, or possibly was the disruption of the top customers of Amazon or a top internet supplier. The agencies are making investments as follows. We identified through interviews about 30 initiatives of the agencies. They were stockpiling sand, stockpiling medicines. They were buying interoperable communications devices. They were doing citizen training and educating members of the population, maybe through churches and schools, what to do in case of these emergencies. And then there were some provisions for disabled and special needs populations. This is the first 10 of them, but there are about 30, and we wrote about it in a paper in the Accident Analysis and Prevention Journal. And we're going to prioritize these 30 and then disrupt them. The base prioritization, I'm going to tell you some about how we arrived to that. It's represented on the triangles here. These are the initiatives of the agencies, 30 out to the right here, 30 initiatives of agencies, and this is their rank order. Here's an initiative that was ranked number 1, number 2, number 3, and when we subjected the initiatives to reprioritization under the several behavioral scenarios, we got this buffeting. This one that was ranked number 1, it ranked as low as number 5. Number 2 ranked as low as number 6. Some of them got kicked up in ranking, kicked down in ranking. I'm going to tell you a bit how we did that. These are criteria of any initiative. Any investment by the preparedness agencies, they have to be able to say to their constituencies and to the federal funding that they've been addressing environment, public health, the preparedness, coordination inside the region, coordination outside the region, sheltering and evacuation, and others. And there's some major criteria and minor criteria. We found which of the initiatives covered which of the criteria. So these are 30 initiatives out to the right, and these are the dozen or so criteria, depending on what's the Likert scale agreement on coverage. That gave us a base prioritization of the initiatives. Once we had the base prioritization of initiatives, we found that particular scenarios or behavioral scenarios, they increased or decreased the importance of the performance criteria. So consider the scenario of walking wounded. It might increase the weights or the importance of criteria that deal with educating or training of the public. That's an example of how we got entries in this matrix. These are the disruptions that gave us the result that I previewed to you earlier. So scenarios led to the vertical height or the change in ranking, the disruption in ranking, disruption in priorities for individual of the initiatives. And this initiative, real-time public information and advisories, the investment in the equipment to provide such things, it had a bit of buffeting of rank, and this might have even been kicked out of its 8th place in the baseline down out of the top 10 by particular of the behavioral scenarios. This is zooming in on that, explaining a bit more of how the updating of priorities occurred when we subjected the prioritization to the scenarios. Some qualitative results is we found that scenario 2 was most disruptive and most changing of the rankings when we considered the disruption all in aggregate. And scenario 5, the workplace behaviors of those private sector workers, it was the least disruptive, for whatever reason, of the priorities for the investments, and so on and so on. This was a way to see what does it all mean to put together our baseline rankings, our initiatives, and our criteria, and our disruptions of the ranking criteria, disruptions of the importance of the ranking criteria. More of those findings qualitatively is that some of the scenarios led to greatest decrease in rank, some of them led to greatest increase in rank. There were initiatives that were lowest ranked and initiatives that were highest ranked, and this is a way to see what's the robustness or sensitivity of all that I showed you to different of the scenarios and different of the criteria. I'm going to say less about this other than we did do a little bit of decision analysis, decision science. We assembled the initiatives and some key combinations, maybe 5 combinations of the 30 initiatives, and then asked how effective were those combinations of initiatives to reduce the population that got on the move. So this was under a do-nothing scenario or status quo, what was already underway. Some of the combinations of initiatives were effective to shift the probability distribution of evacuees to the left, reducing the fraction of people that were on the move. So what were the lessons learned? We learned a lot about sociology from the sociologists, from transportation, about transportation from the transportation experts, a little from the systems engineers, and they were indeed important findings and implications for the agencies making investments. They were investing in gear, in new and different skills of their staff. They were changing the plans and the priorities of the agency, respecting now what was understood about population behaviors in a large emergency. Since we did this work, California State exercised against zombie attack. So you could say, well, your radiological scenarios, this one's not going to occur the way it did. California let loose their imagination and recognized it doesn't so much matter the particular scenario, that's never going to happen, but it's the understanding of how agencies talk to one another, make right or wrong assumptions about the people, and what people say they will do is sometimes some way different from what they will actually do. And this was a bit more of the qualitative findings. Reminding we found pieces of the roadway needing more attention than others, and all the disobedience leading to breakdowns of the road network. It led to recommendations for risk management, and that's the end of this example. So what I want to share to you, convince you that as industrial engineers, you can take knowledge and domain knowledge from one application to another. That's part of the strength of your curriculum. You can learn from aerospace, and have the courage to move that to an environmental problem. You can learn from undersea exploration and move that to a study of healthcare and medicine. So all this is that methodologies and tools that you're learning in your classes here, you can move from one application to another. With my students, work that we published in last year's Risk Analysis Journal, we studied the power grid of Afghanistan and what are the conditions politically, economically, markets, environmentally, with food disease and others. What are the emergent and future conditions that should disrupt the priorities for thousands of investments that are being made in the power grid? And those investments range from cutting trenches in the earth to drilling for natural gas in the north of the country to providing power lines and so on and so on. And this was a different but important application of the methods that I previewed to you in the other example. We created a way for the donor nations in Afghanistan to study the progress of the investment and to track the critical investments. It wasn't very long after the example in Washington, we studied radiological emergency that could occur around the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. And it wasn't enough. We said not only there could be this radiological emergency, but because of the nuclear plant near to Rio, they might experience a power blackout at the same time. And with my students and some of the same students who were involved in the Washington Capital region, we took data on what agencies said to what other agencies in an exercise, and found that the favela populations, the homes and houses that are built on the unstable hillsides, that they were quite vulnerable to these types of situations, maybe warranting some training for the children or parents or yet else residents of the favela populations. Reminding, we studied power blackout and radiological. The actual scenarios that befell the Rio Olympics had more to do with water quality and the delays of construction. But we felt we made a contribution nevertheless. We were teaching them what they said to one another, needs for agencies to interrelate. So in the fall of this year, recent year 2017, the nation made a commitment to invest in broadband networks, wireless networks for public safety. So for fire, ambulance, and police, supporting all kinds of apps that have come available on the scene of crises and emergencies. And we created 5 and more scenarios that had to do with the enterprise investment, and asked how disruptive were these scenarios to the plans to go to broadband wireless for public safety. So this is another application. One of my master's students is near to publishing this work. In parallel with those other disaster studies, we did a study on the airports of the United States. There are about 500 of those, 500, 600 airports, and we asked which of those are vulnerable more or less to runway incursions, when an aircraft collides with another aircraft on the runway, or when an aircraft collides with a fuel truck, or a fuel truck collides with a baggage cart, or someone walking is struck by a vehicle. These are all runway incursions, and we identified the factors that are most telling about the airport having high incursion rates, low incursion rates. They have to do with weather, with geometry, with the number of operations, with the angle of the sun at particular times of year. And we created 3 scenarios. Remember, risk as the influence of scenarios to priorities. We created a scenario from the pilot's point of view. We created a scenario from the owner's point of view, and from the regulators or the FAA's point of view. And we found the ranking of airports was indeed quite volatile depending on the scenario: pilot, regulator, airport owner, operator. These are the airports in a single region of the FAA, about 60 airports in this region. The baseline ranking is with the diamond, and then when we put those scenarios to work and change the weights on the criteria importance, my goodness, this 4th ranked airport, it went all the way down to 75 or 80 in its ranking. So lots of volatility depending on the perspective that was taken on the data. In a follow-on to that, I've done some resource allocation of trainings to the airports. Which airports would more justify having training, having person-to-person interaction, review of how the control tower speaks to pilots, how the pilots speak to the towers at these 600 airports across America. And this is some of the, each one of these is an airport. This is it's plotted by the operations. The takeoffs and landings is the horizontal, and the runway incursion rate is the vertical. Any airport above the top contour is justified for immediate training or training in the near term. These others, it's a question, and these others, it's not clear that training is going to be beneficial because it has both low takeoffs and landings and low incursion rates. In one of the last examples I'm going to share, we prioritized the villages of Alaska subject to sea level rise and erosion. And we asked, what are the conditions that combine with climate change that disrupt priorities for investment to reduce erosion in about 160, 200 communities around Alaska. These are villages with maybe indigenous populations, Native American populations. Some of that is the type of investment that's being considered to be made, pouring concrete steps along the banks of rivers and coastal areas in Alaska. So scenarios of climate change. And there are scenarios of disruption affecting container ports. Those have to do with labor strikes and with weather, extreme weather. They have to do with the new technologies that come about. They have to do with increasing traffic. They have on the arterials near to the port. They have to do with changing of the shippers moving different types and volumes of containers. So at this moment, we're doing some scenario analysis disrupting the container traffic at a port. We are believing with many nations around the world that the vehicle fleets are going to turn over to electric into the future, maybe on the order of a decade, and that the vehicles are going to be sharing energy resources. So we've done some scenario modeling. What are the factors that should and do disrupt investments in the enterprise of charging infrastructure? This relies on knowledge. What does the charger need to know from the vehicle? What does the vehicle need to know from the charger? And what do the chargers need to know from one to another? And we published this work in IEEE Journal. Even as we're investing in the high tech, it's important still to invest in the highway network. And these are different scenario assumptions based on economics, based on land uses and demographics and other behaviors, how the different scenario assumptions matter to showing where the development will occur and threaten the capacities of the highway system. We built some influence diagram to show all the factors playing together and forecast or predict land use adjacent to the highway network. And we plotted in this situation along the arterials where the greatest densities of access points, of cuts in the roadway per mile. This is about a 100-mile section of roadway west of Washington, D.C. Access points per mile is showing in this diagram. And the lower diagram is a trace of the daily traffic. So similar to what I showed you for the FAA, but in a different kind of picture, traffic volume and the intensity of the hazard here, the access points per mile, and ranging from 0 to 50 or 40 access points per mile, threatening the mobility of the arterial and the traffic volume. This was important not only to know at a single section of roadway, but these are comparing and contrasting different sections of road. These are from about 100 miles, 300 miles of road in this lower, 300, 400 miles here, 400 miles here. And across the top of each one of them are the forecast hotspots for land development, for economic development adjacent to the road. Similar to the FAA, we were able to look at the hundreds and even thousands of access points and show those that are most likely to yield benefits that exceed costs when the investment would be made. So closing of access points, the programs for investing in closing access points, they might justify only a few access points out of the many hundreds or thousands. The different colors here are when we consider safety, when we consider travel time benefits, and when we consider safety and travel time benefits together. This green is the safety and travel together. More access points are justified to be closed. Red was the safety, and blue was the travel time benefits. That all got wrapped into these charts. These are the actual locations on the map, not only in the scatter plot, where the access points ought to be closed. High priority for closing these access points around the state. This is, remember, filtering from a great many thousands of miles of roadway. These are the locations that are justified to be closed based on the travel time benefits. And these are the locations that are justified to be closed if we consider both travel time benefits and safety benefits together when we add the benefits. The last I'm going to show you is these are two transportation projects in the coastal region of Virginia, near to Virginia Beach. And they have a ranking under a baseline, and then a ranking when we subject them to several scenarios. Climate change mixed with demographic change, climate change mixed with other ecological change, climate change mixed with wear and tear. And it's a way saying we can go deeply into these kind of results, and we can find is this real understanding or insight, or does it match our understanding, improve our understanding in any way? So this is once we drill down on these kind of results. And this is reminding the icons that we're using already, a baseline ranking and a highest and lowest ranking across scenarios. We did it not only for the projects, new investments, but for the transportation assets. Which assets are most needing to be maintained or not? These are bridges and tunnels and smart communications, smart travel centers, so both hard and soft amenities of the transportation system. And you can see some of these assets are quite volatile when we subject them to scenarios of climate change. And we did it also, we updated priorities for transportation policies, such as Go Green, or enhance amenities for pedestrians, or improve intermodal connectivity. These are the most soft at the policy level. About 30 policies you can see they're some way sensitive to updating of rankings. The biggest lesson from this was that when we considered disruption of priorities for projects, disruption of priorities for policies, disruption of the priorities for transportation assets, and these are the geographic locations, disruption of priorities for geographic locations across the system. When we considered climate change alone as a scenario, it didn't have as much effect. We considered climate plus economic downturn in the region, another medium effect in a little different directions, disrupting more the priorities for the policies and the geographies. Modest effect when we combine climate with wear and tear on the system, similarly climate and ecology. Only when we combined climate with demographic shifts, movement of populations toward and away from the region, we got a bit bigger shape and disruption in particular of the policies and the assets priorities. So climate alone was less of a disruptor than when we mixed it with the owners of the other topics. All this work, the applied research, got translated into work by graduate students published in conferences. I'm going to say a little bit about some of these organizations in the slides that come up. And variously, the work that came out of this, it was driven by the application. It was a new type of methodology, if it's more to the left in this chart, and it's driven more by the theory and theory of our collaborators if it's high in the chart. And my students are currently working on mathematical descriptors of disruption. So they're asking if the 1,000 companies of Germany are disrupted in a particular way relative to the 1,000 companies of Japan or of the United States. How do we measure the disruption? How is it a measure of risk if these disruptions occur and they're minor or they're major? All the work that I showed you, it has a little bit of roots in decision science and scenario and risk analysis, but our strongest effort is we're taking scenario-based preferences, which is saying that it matters to the stakeholders, their values really shift after 9/11 in the United States, after the downturn in 2008, after Katrina, 2005, that there's a shift in preferences, and that updates priorities for investments and priorities for assets and so on and so on. That's this, and then these at the top are some dissertations of my students where they're trying to see what does this matter to investments in research and development? What does it matter when we do this in multiple time periods? What does it matter when we consider the movements of stakeholders? So I'm winding up with, is anyone a French speaker in the room? Who's going to volunteer for that? Roughly, this is saying those who know where they're going from the start will never go far. And it's a nice phrase for your industrial engineering careers, because requirements will evolve and the missions and purposes of the systems that you invent and analyze will evolve. And particularly if you're going to work into the future on smart cities and grand challenges of engineering, this is the critical phrase by maybe the key inventor of systems engineering philosophy. And your teacher advisor works on the topic of system resilience, and it's so wedded with systems engineering and what was the vision of Napoleon, because resilience really means you're not going to be where you plan to be. And this is the adjusting and coping with that. It's a purpose of industrial and systems engineering. Into your careers as you leave University of Oklahoma and the brilliance that you have here in your courses, it's going to be so important for you to align with a professional organization. And one of the largest for engineers on the earth is the IEEE. IEEE Systems Council is one home for industrial engineers. IEEE Systems Man and Cybernetics Society. I already met University of Oklahoma graduate students who attend the Operations Research Society meetings, the Council on Systems Engineering. There's engineering systems universities worldwide, and of course, a strong base for your department in industrial engineering. My own home society is the Risk Analysis Society, and all those scenarios that I described subjected the several systems. They are coming from expertise that lives in our Risk Society. They're experts there on materials science, on microbes and health, environment, ecology, dose response, particularly for radiological protection, and even a good amount of folks concerned with the enterprise risk management called applied risk management for businesses and corporations engaging with one another. And I hope you'll consider to join us for our 5th World Congress. We've had World Congresses in Brussels, in Sydney, Australia, and Guadalajara, Mexico, more recently in 2015 in Singapore. And our World Congress focusing on development and risk analysis, development and resilience, that's coming in Cape Town in 2019 in May. And many of you are aware there's a major water crisis there. It's a signal to all the earth to be more respectful of scarce water and other natural resources. So this is a little bit of the software that my team is developing at UVA. Some you can reach from my webpage there. And it has this theme of scenario disruption. You can turn the dials on this. And I told you I'm so grateful to have been invited here, and thank you for your attention in this class.